Today was the third day of my marriage, and once again, I found myself in my father in law's room. As soon as I entered, my two sisters in law left without a word. The entire night was to be spent in that room, doing everything my father in law asked of me. Once my sisters in law left, the same routine started again. After an hour, I was completely exhausted. I had no strength left, and waves of sleepiness started to hit me. I desperately wanted to run back to my own room, but my father in law refused to let me go. He just wasn't done. I began to feel anger toward my in laws. Why had they made this my responsibility? My marriage was with my husband, not my father in law. How could they expect me to do this? As I sat there seething, my father in law eventually fell asleep. Still fuming, I staggered out of his room, groggy and barely able to keep my eyes open. I hadn't gone far when I felt a hand on my shoulder. I let out a scream, nearly jumping out of my skin. When I turned, there stood my elder sister-in-law glaring at me. "I left you in Dad's room, didn't I?" she snapped. "I already explained that you're supposed to spend this whole week there. Don't you understand what I said the first time? This is how it works in our family." My own elder sister-in-law stayed in Dad's room for 7 days, and only after that was she allowed to see her husband. Do I have to keep explaining this to you? I was mortified by her words. Without saying anything, I turned around and quietly went back to the room. By then, my father-in-law had woken up, and the whole ordeal began again. I was exhausted to the point where I could barely stand. My back ached terribly, my eyes felt heavy with sleep, and yet he showed no mercy. Finally, morning came, and my sister-in-law told me I could return to my room and get some rest. "You've been awake all night," she said. I collapsed into my bed, and when I finally woke up, it was only because my sister-in-law shook me. "You've really overslept today," she said, staring at me with an odd expression. Her comment made me feel ashamed. A full week passed like this. Day after day, the routine remained the same. By now, I was growing increasingly restless, questioning this strange custom that had been thrust upon me. I had never heard of any tradition that required a bride to avoid seeing her husband's face for 2 weeks. What was the point of all this? What was the secret behind this bizarre practice? As my frustration mounted, I began to suspect the worst. Maybe my husband had some flaw. Perhaps he was so hideously unattractive that his family didn't want me to see him. Surely they had tricked me into this marriage, hiding the truth about their son's appearance. That thought alone made my blood boil. My anger grew so intense that I didn't know what to do with myself. I decided I couldn't stay silent any longer. But what could I do? Until the 2 weeks were up, I had no choice but to observe my surroundings carefully and bide my time. In the end, 2 weeks came and went, then 3, and still the same routine continued. Even after all that time, I had yet to meet my husband. Until now, I was just as I had been when I left my parents' home. Frustrated, I finally confronted my sister-in-law and asked about this situation. Her reaction was harsh. She said I was the most shameless woman she had ever met. "Why are you in such a hurry to see your husband?" she snapped. Her words humiliated me. "Decent women don't talk about such things," she added, leaving me stunned. That same day, my mother came to visit me. I was asleep at the time, and without letting her see me, my sister-in-law sent her back telling her that I was away on my honeymoon. I found out about it that night when my mother called. When I questioned my sister-in-law again, she replied that I had been sleeping and she didn't want to disturb me since I had been staying awake all night. Hearing her explanation, I couldn't say anything. But by that night, as I sat in my father-in-law's room, my patience finally wore out. I knew I needed to make a decision. Once my father-in-law fell asleep, I quietly left his room. I was determined to go to my own room and see my husband. I wanted to speak to him clearly to understand what was going on, but when I got to my room, it was completely empty. There was no one there. I couldn't help but wonder, where was my husband? Feeling exhausted from everything, I lay down on the bed and fell asleep. I'd been doing this duty for so long that it had drained me. If my sister-in-law brought it up again, I told myself, I'd give her a piece of my mind. But she never mentioned it. Despite that, I still hadn't seen my husband's face. In fact, I didn't know anything about him aside from his name. What made things even harder was that I wasn't allowed to visit my parents. My in-laws had explicitly told my family that they wouldn't send me back for at least 2 months. They claimed that girls who went home too soon would never fully settle in their new homes. My mother disagreed with them, but she kept quiet for the sake of my marriage. I, too, hadn't shared any of my struggles with her. I knew it would only worry her, and what could she do? The situation with my husband was so tangled, I couldn't make sense of it. One day, I decided to subtly probe the household's longtime maid. In our conversation, I learned that my husband would return home late at night and leave early in the morning. Armed with this information, I began paying closer attention. One night, when everyone was asleep, I quietly slipped out of my room and sat in the darkened garden. I waited, hoping to finally confront my husband and speak to him directly. As I sat there, I noticed the maid in the garden, too. She paced back and forth, repeatedly dialing a number on her phone. I was taken aback. I hadn't known she even had a mobile phone, let alone who she might be calling at this hour. Then I heard a car horn at the front gate. The car pulled up not far from where I was sitting, and I stood up, ready to confront my husband as soon as he arrived. But before I could speak or even approach him, I overheard the conversation between the maid and the driver. What I heard left me utterly shocked. Throughout my life, my every wish had always been fulfilled. After completing my college education, I began receiving numerous marriage proposals. My mother thought it was time for me to settle down, and she seriously considered a few options. After some careful thought and discussion with my father, they decided on a proposal that seemed ideal for me. I was taken by surprise when I expressed a desire to meet my fiancé. My mother brushed off my request, explaining that in their family, it wasn't customary for the bride and groom to see each other before the wedding. I asked if I could at least see a picture of him, but she just laughed and told me, "We've seen the boy, and he's very decent and respectable. You should trust our choice. After the wedding, you'll have plenty of time to see him." Her words made me blush, but deep down, I found it strange. After all, I had every right to see the picture of the man I was going to marry. Yet I didn't know how to bring it up with anyone else but my mother. Things moved quickly, and within just 2 months, the wedding date was set. On the first day of my marriage, I found myself anxiously waiting for my husband. Our wedding had been somewhat untraditional. I hadn't seen my husband's face, and my heart was racing at the thought of meeting him. A few hours had passed since I'd arrived at my in-laws' house, yet the man I had married was nowhere to be found. I hadn't even caught a glimpse of him. I remembered how even at the Mendi ceremony, his absence had puzzled me. In our family tradition, the groom joins the bride's family for the Mendi, but their customs were entirely different. Not only had he not shown up for the Mendi, but no one had even shown me his photograph. During the send-off, my mother had offered me a lot of advice. No matter what you find pleasant or unpleasant, you must remain patient and calm, she had said. I took her words to heart, vowing to approach this new chapter with understanding. Midnight came and went, but still there was no sign of my husband. Then came a knock on the door, causing me to shrink into myself. This was it, the moment I'd been waiting for. My first meeting with my husband was about to happen. As the door opened, my anticipation turned to confusion. Instead of my husband, it was my younger sister-in-law standing there. Her presence startled me, and she seemed just as surprised by my reaction. She told me, "Please change your clothes and come with me. There's something important I need to discuss with you." For a moment, I was stunned. Why would she ask me to change? Why did she need to speak with me so urgently? My mind raced with all sorts of troubling thoughts. Had something happened to my husband? Were they hiding something from me? An uneasy feeling settled over me, and my face grew pale. I licked my dry lips, trying to calm myself, but I felt frozen. I had so many questions, yet I said nothing. Instead, I complied and followed her silently. She led me to another room. Inside, my elder sister-in-law and my father-in-law were waiting. My elder sister-in-law began to explain, "You probably don't know this, but in our family, the bride doesn't see her husband's face for 2 weeks. During that time, she serves her father-in-law and stays in his room." Her words shocked me. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. I'd never encountered such a tradition before. I couldn't fathom the reasoning behind it, nor could I express my confusion and disbelief. All I could do was stand there, trying to process the idea that for the next 2 weeks, I wouldn't meet my husband. Instead, I would be spending my nights in my father-in-law's room, fulfilling some strange custom I had never heard of before. When I heard my sister-in-law's words, it felt as if the ground beneath me had disappeared. How was this even possible? My mind raced through every story and incident I'd ever heard. Those tales where a father-in-law looked inappropriately at his daughter-in-law. Oblivious to my growing unease, my sister-in-law continued speaking, explaining that I couldn't see my husband's face until 2 weeks had passed. "You can't go to him now," she said. "You must first prove yourself worthy by passing this test. For now, you'll stay here and serve your father-in-law." Her words sounded absurd to me, like a foreign language I couldn't understand. But then, my mother's advice echoed in my mind. "When you go there, don't do or say anything that might bring shame upon our upbringing. That is your home now. You must spend your life there. Do as they say, without questioning." Tears welled up in my eyes as I thought of my mother's words, but she hadn't prepared me for this. She hadn't told me what to do when faced with such unexpected and unreasonable demands. Should I silently comply, or should I speak up against these strange customs? I couldn't find any logic in their traditions. Why was I forbidden from seeing my husband's face? A troubling thought crossed my mind. Was he an exceptionally ugly man or far older than I was? Had they deceived me into marrying someone I wouldn't have chosen if I'd known the truth? I felt a chill of fear deep in my chest, as if a dark betrayal was slowly revealing itself. Maybe that's why, after the wedding, my in-laws had told my parents I wouldn't be allowed to visit them for 2 months. My body began to tremble. What could they be planning for me during those 2 months? A sense of foreboding weighed heavily on me. What if they meant to harm me? What if they planned to kill me? As my sister-in-law was leaving, she turned back and said, "I'm sure your mother told you that this is your home now, and everything that happens here must stay here. You are not to share any of this with your family." Her warning made my knees shake. I fully realized my position. I had no say in anything. I also knew that in my family, once a woman was married, it was considered improper for her to speak ill of her husband or in-laws, even if she was in the right. Perhaps my in-laws knew this about my family, which was why they were taking advantage of the situation. Tears burned in my eyes, but I stayed silent. I sat beside my father-in-law as instructed, and, following my elder sister-in-law's orders, began to massage his legs. All the while, I was filled with regret and sorrow over my fate. I spent the entire night rubbing his legs and head, unable to shake the thought that my husband, whoever he was, had no desire to see me. Could it be that he had been forced into this marriage too? My mind was a storm of unanswered questions. Why didn't he want to see me? What kind of person was he? What truth about him was being hidden from me? These thoughts consumed me, driving me to find out who he really was. One night, under the cover of darkness, I decided to act. I slipped out, making sure no one saw me. I wanted to discover the truth about my husband. I followed the sounds and voices coming from the house, keeping a safe distance so I wouldn't be noticed. I trailed behind them as they made their way to a room tucked away in the far corner of the house. That's when I heard his name, and I realized this man was my husband. My heart raced as I finally saw him. To my surprise, he was incredibly handsome. My fears of him being hideous or much older were entirely unfounded. But the discovery didn't bring relief. Instead, it raised even more questions. Why had they kept us apart? What was the purpose of this strange tradition? And why had no one in the family told me about it beforehand? I stood there in the shadows, my mind whirling, unsure of what to do next. No doubt I had never seen such a handsome man in my life. Yet the maid's ease and familiarity with my husband baffled me. Why was she waiting for him until midnight? Why did she go into his room? These were questions that could only be answered if I followed her into the room. When I peeked through the door's crack and saw what was happening inside, everything suddenly became clear. The reason my husband hadn't spoken to me, the reason he had kept his distance, it all hit me like a bomb. I returned to my room and burst into tears. I was a girl with delicate feelings. I had never wronged anyone in my life, and I couldn't comprehend how something so terrible could happen to me. How could this man betray me so cruelly? The next day, I called my mother and told her that I wanted to come back home, even if only for a few days. My mother hesitated, saying that my in-laws might not like the idea of me leaving. In anger, I told her that if she didn't come to get me, I would leave on my own. She understood then how serious the situation was. She had already been uneasy about my sisters-in-law's behavior, and she had been worried that whenever she visited, she never managed to meet me or my husband. When my mother arrived the next day, my sister-in-law tried to stall her as usual, but this time, I was ready. I emerged with my bag in hand. My sister-in-law looked stunned when she saw me. I told her calmly that I was going to my mother's place for a few days. Her face turned pale. She tried to stop me, saying, "Wait for a few more days. Ask your husband first. You can't leave the house without his permission." A bitter smile spread across my face. I replied, "You and I both know the truth. From now on, everything will be out in the open." With that, I took my mother's hand and left the house. My mother was just as surprised as my sister-in-law. Even as I walked away, my sister-in-law followed, trying to stop me. But I was no longer willing to stay silent. When I got home, I told my family everything I had heard and seen. It turned out that my husband had been married before, many years ago. They had no children, and the woman whom my sisters-in-law referred to as a maid was actually my husband's first wife. That night, when I overheard them in the room, I realized the truth. She had been telling my husband to get rid of me, saying she couldn't tolerate having another wife in the house. My husband had responded, "You know I only married her to have children. Once we have a child, I'll send her away. You're the one who doesn't let me near her. I don't even talk to her for your sake. She's a simple, naive girl. I didn't expect her to be so gullible, but at least she hasn't caused any trouble. Don't worry, she won't cause any problems in the future either. It won't be difficult to push her aside and send her away. After all, it was you who asked me to marry her. If you hadn't agreed, I would never have gone through with it. I could never even think of doing something that would upset you." Now the two of them were laughing at my foolishness, and seeing that made my heart cry tears of blood. From the very first day of my marriage, I had been serving my father-in-law, massaging his feet through the night until I was completely exhausted. Yet he would not let me rest. He insisted that I keep massaging until the morning sun rose. I couldn't understand why they were subjecting me to this torment. What did they gain from making me suffer? Slowly, I began to realize that perhaps my husband was not mentally ready for this marriage. It seemed my sister-in-law and father-in-law were trying to distract me, keeping me tangled in these so-called rituals for 7 days, while they worked on convincing my husband to accept me as his wife. When I finally told my family about what had been happening, they couldn't believe it. They invited my husband and in-laws over, laid everything out before them, and confronted them. Embarrassed, my in-laws admitted that they had arranged this second marriage so my husband could have children. They confessed that they feared my family would refuse the proposal if they knew the truth. While they claimed their intentions weren't bad, the fact remained that they had deceived us on such a significant matter. My husband, despite being my husband in name, had yet to give me the rights of a wife. After discussing the situation with my parents, I made the decision to file for divorce. My sisters-in-law pleaded with me, trying to dissuade me from going through with it, but I refused to listen. For the first time, my husband spoke to me. For the first time, he stood before me. However, my decision was final. I was unwavering and would not back down, not even an inch. I despised being betrayed, and I knew I couldn't allow such people to remain in my life. Soon enough, I followed through and obtained the divorce. In the months that followed, I faced countless taunts and criticisms from those around me. People told me I should have tried to make the marriage work, even if it meant sacrificing my dignity or enduring endless pain. Some believed I should have remained in that so-called relationship, no matter what it cost me. I despised their mindset, and I wanted to challenge these deeply rooted social beliefs. Eventually, I joined an NGO that worked to help vulnerable women. Through this, I found a way to channel my experiences into something meaningful. I realized that the pain I had endured and the strength I'd shown in standing up for myself could be used to support other women who were trapped in similar situations. Though I faced judgment and insults, I never regretted my decision. I knew in my heart that I had done the right thing, and whenever people tried to belittle me or question my choices, I would think to myself, "May God spare your daughters from ever enduring the pain I went through." Only those who have suffered understand how unbearable it is. Despite the harsh judgments and the cruelty of others, I held on to my belief that no woman should be forced to live a life of humiliation and betrayal. I stood firm in my resolve to challenge these outdated notions and to support other women in finding their strength.